Hello, I am Hannah Douglas. I am at Macquarie University in Sydney, Australia. And because I'm in Australia, I probably won't be available to respond to questions and comments during the live viewing of this presentation. It's probably about midnight for me right now, but I do look forward to your comments and would be happy to answer any questions that you might have via email. So in this presentation, I'm going to describe two studies that examine the disclosure of a concealable stigmatized identity as a perturbation to a complex system. And a concealable stigma is any identity that is not visibly apparent, but would be socially devaluing if revealed. Despite the risk of discrimination, disclosure is an important aspect of identity management, and when responded to positively, can also result in improved quality of life. Now, though the disclosure process is by nature interpersonal, little research has examined the interpersonal dynamics during and following a disclosure event. So much of what we know is based on memory recall and self-report. So therefore, we had a research confederate in these two studies who posed as a study participant, and they disclosed either a depression diagnosis, a bisexual disclosure, or a neutral disclosure to examine the unfolding movement dynamics immediately after the disclosure event. And I'm conceptualizing stigma disclosure as a perturbation, as it inserts ambiguity and into the interaction. And this has been described in qualitative work, where participants mention feeling uncertain about a relationship after revealing a sexual assault experience. And that ambiguity soon settled into either a more positive or more negative relationship. And I propose here that stigma disclosure reorganizes the interpersonal relationship and will in turn influence emergent behavioral dynamics. So our overall aim of this project asks if stigma disclosure impacts behavioral dynamics during joint action. So the first behavior we're going to explore is spontaneous synchrony. During a joint action task, co-actors will tend to coordinate their movement with one another, either through turn taking in a conversation, or in this example, quickly changing direction in a group. Uh, while these players are shifting in sync due to the constraints of the specific goal at hand, synchrony may also emerge under less rigid conditions. So for example, here, these three players are expressing dissatisfaction in just about the same way at the same time. Now, while BuzzFeed stated that this phenomena was mildly uncomfortable, according to their headline, it is actually quite common and oftentimes necessary to successfully complete a task. While interpersonal synchrony has been studied fairly widely, little work has examined it in the stigma context. In one study where participants rated the degree to which two hands were coordinated, mixed race hands were labeled as less coordinated compared to same race hands, despite there being no difference. So participants viewed two hands moving in relative coordination, and in fact, they were exactly the same, but hands that were mismatched by race were perceived as less coordinated. Okay, and this is particularly important in a stigma disclosure, as a recent meta-analysis of this work found that synchrony generally leads to increased pro-social behavior and social bonding. Now, one common intervention for reducing stigma is intergroup contact. This work shows that contact with an outgroup member generally reduces negative attitudes. And while interpersonal interaction is foundational to this theory, most work has examined either generally pre-test, post-test attitudes without actually describing the behavioral dynamics during the interaction. So in this study, we attempt to remedy this by measuring the degree to which participant will spontaneously synchronize rhythmic arm curl movement with a research confederate following a disclosure event. So the next behavior of interest is one that you probably are all very familiar with at this point. It is the reason we are presenting remotely today, and that is social distancing. While social distancing is an important epidemiological intervention to reduce virus spread, it has also been an indicator of negative attitudes towards stigmatized groups and is thought to reveal an avoidance of catching the stigma by association. In fact, participants who endorsed colorblind attitudes towards non white individuals increased physical distance with non white partners. So, in this study, I'll describe later on, we measured social distancing with a walking collision avoidance task. And this was adapted from Mike Richardson's work, where participants moved a stimulus dot on a screen between two targets. Okay. And the main goal is to move back and forth in a repetitive manner while avoiding hitting the other person or the other dot. Through this work, they discovered three modes of behavior that emerged for successful completion of the task. And we are most interested in this third behavior here, where one person maintains a straight line trajectory, essentially forcing the other participant into a more elliptical pattern in order to avoid colliding. Right, so this work was guided by three overarching research questions. One is, does intergroup contact increase positive attitudes towards stigmatized groups? So this would just be confirming that contact hypothesis. Research question two asks if participants exhibit less spontaneous synchrony with the confederate in the stigma disclosure conditions compared to a neutral disclosure. And finally, will participants exhibit more social distancing when interacting with the confederate in the stigma disclosure condition compared to a neutral disclosure during the walking collision avoidance task? So I'm going to really quickly go through this overall method. We did run this study twice with the same method, and I'll describe a little bit the differences later on as we go through the results. So first, all participants completed a online pre-test about 5 to 7 days before their lab participation, and this just measured attitudes towards bisexual women and people with depression. Those were our target categories, and we did this with the feeling thermometer. Next, once they arrived in the lab, participants were told that the purpose of the study was to understand in-person interaction after getting to know each other remotely, and they were told that they would answer a series of questions over a Skype call. Okay, in reality, the Confederate responses were pre-recorded. And to the question, in a few sentences, what is something few people know about you? They would have heard either a bisexual disclosure, a depression disclosure, and or that the Confederate never learned how to ride a bike, which was our neutral disclosure. Participants then rated how much they like their study partner or how close they feel to their study partner. Again, at this point, the participant and the Confederate have not met in person. Okay, and to characterize spontaneous synchrony, participants first completed a rhythmic arm curl task on their own, then again coupled with a pre-recorded video disguised as a Skype call. Movement was recorded from two Vive controllers in the right and left hand and compared to the Confederate time series. Synchronization was measured by coherence. This is described in the conference proceedings in more detail, but essentially values close to 0 indicate no coordination and 1 would be perfect coordination. And during the coupled condition, participants weren't given explicit instructions to coordinate their movement, so any synchronization is spontaneous here. Okay. After this, the Confederate entered the room and they completed the collision avoidance walking task, which I described in a little bit of detail earlier. So again, the research Confederate maintained a straight line trajectory, forcing the participant to walk in an elliptical pattern to avoid collision. And you can see here that our participant data, they generally wanted to maintain that straight line trajectory, but were forced to give way, so as not to run into each other. And we measured social distancing through circular deviation, or the average distance away from the participant or away from the research confederate. Okay, then finally, participants responded to a post-test questionnaire, which again measured attitudes with the feeling thermometer, as well as liking and closeness, with the inclusion of the other in the self scale. If you are interested in these surveys or these scales, you can pause the screen. Okay, and finally, part of the debrief, ask participants to rate the degree to which they believed their study partner was a participant. And this was particularly important because in study one, we recruited exclusively from the psychology participant pool. And participants in the study were fairly suspicious of the manipulation, with some stating they were trying to guess the purpose based on their coursework. So therefore, in study two, we recruited a community sample exclusively, and there was much less suspicion in this sample. And you can note the relatively small sample sizes here. Keep that in mind as I describe the results. Right, so first, in line with the contact hypothesis, participant attitudes in study one towards each group did generally improve following the interaction. However, this was not significant given the high degree of variability as well as the small sample size. And in study two, we did not see nearly as strong of an increase in attitudes towards bisexual women. However, again, in study two, attitudes were already fairly favorable. All right, now it gets a little bit more confusing. Now, contrary to expectations, in study one, despite more favorable attitudes towards the stigmatized groups as a whole, participants generally liked the Confederate significantly less after the joint action tasks. And this is probably due to the high degree of suspicion, as we saw the opposite pattern in study two, where participants liked the Confederate significantly more following the disclosure and the joint action tasks. However, in both samples, there was no significant difference in liking as a function of disclosure type. So across the board, participants tended to like their study partner better after the in-person joint action task compared to at time one. And we can see the same pattern of results with our closeness item. While participants in study one did not feel closer to their task partner at time two, they did feel significantly closer in study two. Okay, though again, this is not explained by disclosure type. Now, getting into the behavioral results, there's not much to say regarding synchrony. In both studies one and two, participants did spontaneously sync their arm movements to the Confederate above chance, though there was no significant difference in coordination between groups. And in fact, in study two, participants were slightly more coordinated following a bisexual disclosure. Right, and now for the results of the collision avoidance task. They're probably the most interesting, though also maybe most confusing. So as expected in study one, um, participants demonstrated the most social distancing in the depression condition following a depression disclosure. However, they also had the least distancing following a bisexual disclosure. And I'm uncertain exactly what this means, though anecdotally, the Confederate has described some participants as being very resistant to give way to her while walking. And these results were not replicated in study two, where there was no difference in social distancing in the bisexual condition and the neutral condition. Again, a larger sample size is needed to more confidently explain these results. So in all, the results of these studies are in line with the contact hypothesis, as interaction did increase positive attitudes towards stigma groups, as well as affiliation in study two only. However, the interpersonal dynamics were a little bit more tenuous. We did not see any difference in coordination, which could actually very well suggest that stigma does not reduce spontaneous synchrony. That's potentially a positive result. As for social distancing, Participants may have given the most distance in the disclosure condition, in the depression disclosure condition, to avoid catching that stigma by association. And perhaps in the bisexual disclosure condition, participants were most hesitant to give up that leader role with the straight line trajectory in the collision avoidance task. Now, as for responding to the title of this talk, these results do not necessarily provide a clear answer as to whether stigma disclosure is strong enough to perturb the system, in this context at least, though I do hope to continue this work with a larger community sample, so I would love to hear your thoughts and your feedback. I would like to thank my co-authors, Rachel Callan and Mike Richardson, and of course our study confederate, Sarah Toohey, for her time and dedication on this project. And thank you for listening, and I also look forward to hearing about your work.